We're going to be going into the cardinal virtues in detail, looking at each one individually. And we begin today with the virtue of prudence. And so, once again, want to review that the definition of virtue is a firm, habitual disposition to achieve the good, our ultimate good, which is God. And remembering that habitual and firm means that it's lasting, it's solid, it's stable, it's that capacity that is there, even when we're not per se utilizing that capacity. It's always there, and it's a disposition, which means it's a power, a capacity, or a capability of doing something. And finally, it is always oriented towards the good. The purpose of virtue is a good action, and it must be good. If it were evil, then it would be a vice. All right, so virtue is good, vice is evil. And so, looking at the virtue of prudence, just some general comments. Um, this would be essentially defined as the virtue of decision making. Right, this virtue is classical antiquity, and especially in the medieval times, St. Thomas Aquinas, they tried to locate the virtues where they are kind of in the person. And of course, the virtues, as we've already indicated, are in the soul, in the spirit of the person. They are not physical things, so they're not in the body, they are in the soul. And the soul is split into two, kind of two parts, you might say, the intellect and the will. The intellect being reason, and the will being that movement of desire and activity and resolve. And also, that's the kind of connection to our bodily desires and sensations as well. Prudence is most rightly seated in the intellect, but it's a go between essentially between the intellect and will and the body, because it's essentially the virtue of right reason in action. So it's kind of that go between, but it's seated most appropriately in the intellect. Um, Historically, it has been called right reason in action. What makes someone prudent is that they are able to do the right thing at the right time. Um, and that right thing is, of course, determined first and foremost by the intellect. And so others have called it the rule and the measure of the other cardinal virtues. What do we mean by rule and measure? If you think about the need to measure something, either in chemistry with a test tube, a beaker, a flask, um, or in any other kind of engineering with measuring instruments, whether it be a ruler or something, that rule or that measure is good. It's stable. It's firm. It doesn't move. It doesn't change. That's essentially what makes it capable of doing its job as being a rule or a measure. Well, how do we know that something is just? We only know that something is just because of prudence. How do we know that something is courageous or not? How do we know when to show courage in the right situation? Or how do we know when to back down from some kind of trouble, um, which is equally courageous, knowing when to step down, knowing when to bow out? How do we know when something is temperate? How do we know when something is reasonable in our desires or not? Well, that's all done through prudence. So, in a sense, all the virtues kind of get their guidance from prudence, right? As we said before, all good acts require all the virtues, meaning any good act that could be classified as good is prudent, just, courageous, and temperate. All right. If it fails in being one of those things, it's not a good act. It's not possible for an act to be prudent and just and courageous, but completely intemperate. But it's still a good act. That's not possible. It has to be all four. Now, when it comes to the moral virtues, the analogy that has been used in antiquity is that imagine you have a chariot. So you have a chariot, the harness is attached to horses, and you have a charioteer. You have the person driving the chariot. Fortitude, temperance, and justice have been likened to the horses of the chariot. They pull the chariot. They're kind of that strength that pulls it. But you need a charioteer. You need the person guiding those virtues. That's prudence. Prudence is the virtue that guides the others. Prudence is what informs the virtue of justice about what is truly just, especially in different situations. Prudence is the virtue that informs the virtue of fortitude, what is truly courageous in a given circumstance, when we should move forward in courage, or when we should have the courage to back down and say, I'm not going to fight this fight today. Prudence is what tells the virtue of temperance that this is truly reasonable. So prudence kind of carries all of these virtues with it in making good acts. So it's kind of the rule and the measure of the other cardinal virtues. We know that something is just through prudence. We know that something is courageous through prudence. And we know that something is temperate through prudence. And so just a few comments on prudence in general. Because prudence is all about decision making, it's all about a process, three steps. And so classically we have discerned three acts of a prudential act. If we're going to make a prudential act, if we're going to utilize prudence to its fullest, we must go through this kind of three-step process. The first is good counsel, right? We must seek and listen to the advice of reasonable people. Once we have sought that advice, once we've done that kind of research, so to speak, we then, and that's kind of outside of ourselves, so we seek and listen to the advice of other reasonable people. We go to the experts, so to speak. Then we come into ourselves, good judgment. Then we must exercise right reason. We must think rightly about this decision. So this is our action, this is our decision. We are responsible for this, which means we do have to listen to others in good counsel, but we must make our own good judgment. And we must think rightly about this. And here's kind of the contrast between what is truly prudential and what is apparently the right and the wrong of our modern day thinking. Right reason is objective. By that I mean it's possible for us to think wrongly about something. We are not the determining factor of what is right and wrong. What is right and wrong is right and wrong in and of itself. We must utilize the reason that we've been given correctly to think about a decision. And then once we have thought about it, once we have made the decision, the third, the final part of a prudential act is command, directly acting upon a sound decision. It's a failure in prudence to not carry out your decision. We have so many people that kind of resolve to do something but never quite get around to doing it. That's a lack of resolve. That's a lack of command. So the three parts of a prudential act: good counsel, seeking and listening to the advice of others, especially reasonable people; good judgment, that is thinking rightly, using our reason correctly about a decision; and once we come to that decision, command, directly acting upon that decision. As a cardinal virtue, and the reason we use the term cardinal, it's not because of the word red in cardinal red. It's from the Latin cardo, which means hinge. And as a hinge virtue, it's a hinge upon which other smaller coordinating virtues are hung. And so we have what we call daughter virtues of the cardinal virtues. So with each virtue that we look at, there's going to be smaller virtues that contribute to the overall virtue of each of the cardinal virtues. And so for the virtue of prudence, we have three primary daughter virtues. The first is circumspection, and you can kind of see how this can fit along with the good counsel portion of the prudential act. Circumspection is that idea, and you see kind of, you break that word down, circum, which means circle, and spection, inspection, where you speculate upon something or think about the surrounding circumstances or consequences. So with every action that we take, we must be careful to consider what are the circumstances of this particular act, And what are the possible consequences of the various different actions that I could take? The second is docility. This especially connects to good counsel, the willingness to be taught and guided, right? Understanding, first and foremost, that we don't know everything, that maybe we need help in our own reasoning, maybe we need help in considering the circumstances and the consequences, maybe we even need help in executing the action that we decide, whatever it may be. But in order to admit that, we have to be docile. In order to be taught and guided, to listen willingly to others, we must be docile. And finally, foresight. Foresight is the virtue of thinking ahead. Now, most especially, this is for consequences, knowing that if I put this action out there, if I execute, if I resolve and with command I commit this action, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to others? What's going to happen down the road in the long run? How might others be affected? Right? That foresight is necessary, especially for big actions. I mean, for smaller actions like brushing your teeth, maybe not so much of an issue. Whether you get pizza or chicken tonight, probably not the biggest of issues. For some, it may be. You never know. But the foresight here is especially for larger actions where we might concern ourselves. And finally, I want to make that distinction between acquired and infused prudence. So we talked about the cardinal virtues. There's an acquired cardinal virtue by which repeated actions that we foster this kind of habitual disposition within us. And then there's the infused virtue. Well, acquired prudence uses sound, natural reason to judge what is reasonable in a situation and to act upon it. Whereas infused prudence uses reason perfected by faith to judge what is in accord with our ultimate destiny and act upon it. So prudence is going to go through that process of taking good counsel from reasonable people around us, making a sound judgment about whatever the decision is, and then with command acting upon it within reason, all right? And that could be any number of things. It could be, what we have for dinner tonight to where we go to school for college. Infused prudence, however, uses reason perfected by faith. What God has revealed to us through sacred scripture and the sacred tradition of the church informs what we do now. And then we judge what is right in accord with our ultimate destiny and act upon it. You see, and that same infused prudence can go for the same decisions. Where I go to college. Am I prayerful? Not only am I taking good counsel from parents, from teachers, from friends about good schools, about what my talents and circumstances are, but am I prayerful? Am I seeking the advice of God Himself about what He may have in store for me? Am I not only judging according to good reason, I'm thinking rightly about all the important things in my life about where to go to school, but am I also thinking about my ultimate destiny? Am I also concerned about how this decision may affect me, not only here on this earth, but how this may affect me ultimately? What will this do to my spiritual life? How will this affect my ultimate destiny? And then the resolve to act upon it, to be courageous, and to make the right decision.